I said that logic models help in evaluation. They help for these kind of 5 reasons here, right? They help you define what should you evaluate, the focus, what appropriate questions are for your evaluation, what information you should collect. We'll talk about indicators in detail because I think that's probably kind of the biggest, vaguest, hardest to wrap your head around. When you should collect your data, so your timing, and then what sources, methods, tools you should use. All of you presumably were elected, appointed, hired. My favorite quote for data nerds is, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And none of us want to be just another person with an opinion. We want to be standing there with data to back up what we're doing, especially if you're standing, being questioned by residents about why you're spending their tax dollars in a certain way or their resources, why they should elect you again, why the elected official who changes over should appoint you or hire you again. So, figuring this piece out and getting to a point of data on all of your projects is really valuable. So that first piece, right, we'll go back to what should you evaluate, and to some extent, what are the questions for your evaluation? You can't do any of that if you don't first determine who your evaluation audiences are. And so where I sit, my evaluation audiences are typically my board of directors and my funders/donors, right? It is, and I would say policymakers, right, to the extent that we're using some of this data to advocate for state level policy change. But at the end of the day, it's my board and my funders and my donors. And so I am thinking about that as I'm developing my evaluation questions. For you all, that may be different, right? You may be sitting there with, again, taxpayers. You might be sitting there with the media questioning why you've done something, what the impact would be. If it involves businesses, right? Maybe it's the businesses sitting there again asking or wanting to know what the impact of their investment in your community may be. And so at the onset, you want to think about who your evaluation audiences are. You want to think a little bit about kind of the relationships and the capacity, whether you're looking at quantity, quality, and again, the outcome, right? Effectiveness versus satisfaction. So those are little bits of kind of give and take. And depending on who your audience is, those may vary. We could sit here and come up with a million different things that those audiences may want to know, but some of the most common, right? Who's at the table? What are we spending on this? How many people are we reaching with this? Or how many businesses are we impacting? How are you doing the evaluation? What do people say about the program? And we'll get into qualitative versus quantitative data in a bit. The one I hear all the time, right? How many people are still hungry, unhoused, uninsured, or how many people in the inverse are no longer hungry, are now housed, are now insured, are now food secure, and why? So think about those pieces as kind of the first step in developing not only the logic model, but the evaluation component of the logic model. I'm going to go back one more time to show you this, right? So when you're thinking about what should you evaluate, what are the right questions, you have to know who your audience is. You then need to think about what information you actually want to collect. And so that's where we get to indicators. Indicators are the measures you select as the markers of your success, and they should be direct, specific, useful, practical, adequate, and culturally appropriate, right? Something to consider depending on where you are. Are you selecting markers that are culturally appropriate and relevant for the community that you're serving and for the audiences that you are doing the evaluation for, whether internal or external? There are any number of indicators, right? And so if you go Google indicators, indicators for evaluation, indicators for nonprofit evaluation, indicators for municipal evaluation, you're going to find a million different indicators out there. Again, if you really drill down to the base of this, all they are is what measures are you using to mark success. This wheel on the right shows you, right, typically falling in kind of 3 buckets, right? Social, economic, environmental. all sorts of indicators in there, right? You've got crime, you have education in the social bucket, you've got income inequality, underemployment over an economic, and then environmental, you've got things like ozone depletion, noise pollution, water pollution. There is no wrong answer to what indicators are you using. There are a lot of guideposts, right? So there are, and I'll show you on the next slide, there are a lot of kind of national, international standardized indicators, but you can go and create whatever indicators you want as long as it answers the questions that those audiences expect of you and that you yourselves want to understand and want to get to the bottom of. Right, and so here's some examples of indicators. Here's two completely different ends of the spectrum. On the bottom are the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? There's 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. Within all 17 of those, there's a litany of kind of sub-measures, sub-metrics, sub-indicators, right? If you look at that first one, no poverty. And then when you kind of click further into that, you'll find that there are all sorts of, again, sub-measures, sub-metrics there. Those UN Sustainable Development Goals are fairly widely known. And so whether you do local or international work, you could go say, we're going to use this standardized measure of the UN Sustainable Development Goals as our indicators, right? We want to kind of benchmark ourselves against those, right? That's one extreme. On the other extreme is that table at the top, and that's you simply coming up with the indicators and measures that work best for your project. This is something we've used with some of the kind of school education-based work. On the left, there are the measures: attendance rates, quality of teaching, dropout rate, and then a very basic number of kids enrolled. A look at whether they're qualitative or quantitative, and we'll talk about the importance between of using both of those. And then what's your starting measure and what's your ending measure? So an attendance rate, for an example, as a quantitative measure, is going to be really easy to look at, right? You're going to figure out what it is when you start a project, and you're going to look at it 6 months or 12 months later. What is it when you completed year one? Quality of teaching, right, as a qualitative measure, may be something that you find out through a survey, right? And so maybe you give a 6-month survey, pre-survey and a post-survey. So at the beginning, you're asking people, what's the quality of teaching? And they say average. And at the end, when you do another survey, they say terrific. So you're also thinking about what are the tools you can use to collect your data, right? When we go back to those 5 different components of using a logic model for evaluation, right? That final one was, what are the tools we're using? And so you can look at this however you want. You can think about, you know, for the Bridgeport group, right, without knowing too much about your project, right, maybe part of it is quantitative measure is around how many businesses you have in a given radius when you start and how many you have when you end. And a qualitative measure may be, it could be from a business perspective of how connected to the community businesses feel. It could be, and you could, you know, do a survey at the beginning and a 1-question survey at the beginning and a 1-question survey at the end. Or it could be for residents, right? Do you have the types of businesses you want within a 1-mile radius, right? I mean, you can think about those sorts of things and what tools you use to get that information, but both quantitative and qualitative are equally valuable. And I think we forget about the fact that qualitative data is just as good of an indicator and a measure of success or not as your more traditional quantitative data. Right, so sky's the limit when you're thinking about indicators, but you do want to come up with that so that from the beginning of the project to the end, or if you're already through year 1, maybe it's year 1 to year 2, you're actually able to measure what you want to measure. All right, so data collection. You know, I just touched on this a little bit, right? Your qualitative could be interviews, it could be focus groups, it could be, you know, surveys that are more narrative form rather than kind of data your typical numerical data rich. It could just be talking to people and hearing their stories. Quantitative is going to be your more structured data collection. And when you think about both, right, you want to think about what the purpose is, what sort of methodology you're going to use, right? If you're going to use a pre and a post survey, you want the pre and the post survey questions to be the same. Otherwise, you can't compare against one another. What are your resources for data collection, right? Like, we don't all have data people at our disposal who can go and crunch data for us in a really comprehensive way. And so how do we get that data with the resources that you have on staff? Google survey, Outlook survey, through Microsoft Forms, right? Those are all really easy tools to use. SurveyMonkey paid for, but you can do just as good of stuff with the Microsoft and the Google platforms. And then what's your timing, right? How do you make sure you're set up from the beginning to the end? I will tell you that when you are talking to funders, right, and you're talking to anything from kind of individual donors, right, which is cases for them investing in local community, all the way up to private funders or, you know, congressionally directed spending through Senators Murphy and Blumenthal, or your state reps looking at appropriations and bonding money. Both are powerful, right? And so don't neglect one in order to get the other. But if you have to start wherever you can so that you have something, right? If all you can do is say, we're going to talk to 5 people who benefited from this investment or this project, start there and don't worry about having a perfect survey set up. Get some of that qualitative narrative. If you're in a place where the best thing you can do is send out a survey at the beginning and a survey at the end, and you have no desire to go talk to folks who are impacted right now because you can't, that's fine. Start with the quantitative, but start somewhere on the data collection.